The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.
Firstly, I wish to thank the organizers for giving me a second opportunity to engage with this program, and congratulations to all the new scholars who have come on board. I must say I tuned in a little bit earlier and even listened to Professor Stella's presentation on transformation. And I must say I feel very honored to be among the star cast of the likes of Stella and Prof. Jonathan Jansen, who is always inspirational, even in his role as the president of the academy, but more so, I think I call him a friend and I can always chirp with him whenever I need to. So coming to the issue at hand, talking about my journey, I just wanted to punctuate it, not starting from my early life, but just to be consistent with the previous talk. I was raised and brought up in Durban in a very conservative Hindu family. Like Prof. Jansen, my parents were working class. My dad only attained a standard 6 and had to go out and work to support the family at age 15. And he stayed with the same company working as a clerk in a bakery until his retirement age at 60. My mom did standard 8 or JC and got a teaching diploma, and she taught also until her retirement. But because she was a married woman and from the Indian community, she could never be on the permanent staff. So until her retirement, she retired as a contract worker, never had been made a permanent staff, and as a result, never had much benefits along the way. Nonetheless, from their meager earnings, they saw from a very early age the opportunities that they didn't have that they would give to us, and that was education. And all three of us children have had the opportunities and freedom of choice to work out what we wanted to do. So my older brother did a degree and ended up being in a police force. He had to do the 6 months training for a lectureship position, but liked being on the beat, so he ended up working, as a officer. And again, being in Durban, not much opportunities for progression. And for 30 plus years, he never changed his status from captain. Others below him went on to reach higher ranks in the police force. But as an Indian being positioned in Durban, he did not have much success. I went into academia, and my younger brother went into the IT world and now lives and works in a very established environment in the US. So my formative years academically, after completing undergraduate studies and an honors degree at the University of Durban-Westville, I came up to WITS in 1986 to do a master's in biotechnology. It was the third year that biotechnology was offered in the country, and so was the era of the new genetics. And I was appointed a bit later because at Durban-Westville, we wrote exams in February. So my data or my results were not available in December for the committee to make a sound on my admission into the course. And a person dropped out, and I was offered the position by Professor Helen Garnett, who ran the course at the time. So although I started 2 weeks later, I was privileged to have had the opportunity to do a master's in biotechnology. And as such, I am one of the first 18 trained biotechnologists in the country. Armed with that degree, Professor Jenkins, who was the head of department of human genetics at Wits University, had put out an advert for medical scientists. And after much oohing and ahhing, I applied and I got a job as a medical scientist and started that position in 1987. And thereafter decided to take studies towards a PhD, which I did part-time under the mentorship of Professor Trevor Jenkins. And that's how, without even formally being educated in human genetics, I attained a PhD with human genetics along the way. And during this progression, my project in the biotechnology was done in Professor Jenny Thompson's laboratory, which was the CSIR labs at the time at WITS. My PhD with Prof. Trevor Jenkins, and he is still around, even though he is emeritus professor. I still keep up meeting with him. He suffers with a little bit of age-related dementia. So I try when I can to do some occupational therapy and just to remind him of the super days that we enjoyed working with him in working towards understanding the peopling of the sub-Saharan African region. Then opportunistically, I was awarded a Share Fellowship in 1990 to go to Penn State University. And this was like, well, not an exchange program, but the three universities of Cape Town, Western Cape, and WITS on a rotatory basis could nominate a scholar. And in the fall or August of 1990, I was selected to do that. And so I went to Penn State in State College of Pennsylvania, and I worked with Ken Johnson, who was an enzymologist. And he was recommended by Professor Val Musrahi, who many of you may know from UCD and her work on TB research. And when I got to Penn State, Trevor had said to me, please go to anthropology and say hello to my friend Henry Harpending. Henry Harpending and Trevor had worked in Botswana and Namibia doing research and fieldwork among the San communities. And so I went to say hello to Henry, and then he asked me what I did. And next thing, he introduced me to people who were part and parcel of the first Institute for Molecular Evolutionary Genetics. And as Professor Janssen said earlier on point 5 of, what it means to become an academic scholar, about connections and connectivity. And coming from South Africa with, so much of baggage of the chip on my shoulder, being a person of color and so on, going into this big wild world, it was very exciting because basically every corridor you walked on, you were meeting people who were icons in the field of evolutionary, molecular evolutionary studies. And one such person was Professor Mark Stoneking, who together with Becky Kahn and the late Alan Wilson from Berkeley had published a seminal paper in 1987 on the use of mitochondrial DNA and reconstructing human history. Mark happened to have been appointed in the faculty of anthropology that fall, and Henry made an appointment for me to meet with Mark, and so my acquaintance with him sparked. And when I finished my 5-month stint in Ken Johnson's lab in enzymology, I asked if I could do some work with Mark Stoneking to learn this new genetics, the analysis, etc., which we in South Africa had no access to, particularly the analytical tools given the academic boycott. And so by mutual arrangement, I was afforded another 3 months to spend time and work with Mark Stoneking. And during that time, he taught me some of the new techniques that was current. And with my links with everyone in the Institute, I also taught myself a little bit of analytical work. So these 3 people have played different roles as mentors to me at various points in my personal journey. I have learned different skills and different strengths from each of them, and I have embraced all of that to give myself my own kind of purpose in life and the way in which I approach my academic and other professional responsibilities. And then between the years of 1996 to about the middle of the 2000s, I worked hard. I really, really worked hard. I set up my own lab upon my return from my postdoc, which I did with Mark Stoneking, I established an external extramural MRC unit under my own ambitions in life, even though Professor Jenkins was kind of on the way out, but I started to claim my own identity. And very quickly, people started to take notice. And as people start to take notice, I realized that the science of laboratory-based science was intricately interwoven with the dynamics of several things going on in the country. There was the issues around politics, about ethics, about being visible as a scientist. And every single opportunity helped me grow more and more. And one idea that I would share with you, my first 10,000 Rand grant that I got from the Medical Research Council as a young scientist, that was a time, even before all these new genetics started to come into the play, I had demonstrated just from my ordinary work this kind of uniqueness of the gene pool of people who self-identified as Khoi and San. And of course, given that I had received the money from the MRC, I was asked to write a little a blurb on the impact of my research, and I submitted that to the lead correspondent for that brief. And next thing, that insert got read in the MRC's report to Parliament. And before I knew it, I hadn't even published this work. It was still work in progress. I was being interviewed around the world on this groundbreaking piece of information. And by the time you came to write it up, it was like stale news. So the one thing I learned from that exercise is, in as much as you think you've done some sexy, groundbreaking work, knowing when to put it out into the public domain is very important, because as I said, by the time I came to publish this work, it was like, so what's new? We all know about this by now. So that's just a lesson that I would share as part of that particular aspect of my journey. And as I said, while of course I was enjoying the work I was doing using specialized types of genetic markers to trace the lineages of patterns of inheritance going way back in time, I realized and very soon got caught up into all kinds of activities. And that's what happens. Remember, this was now in the kind of new administration post-apartheid. I was a female, I was a Black female, and with other disadvantages of height and weight and everything else, I scored every tick box people were aspiring to have at committee levels. And when you are young and you start getting asked to be all over, just that excitement is there, but very soon I learned I had to be very specific on what I took on, because you still have to do your day job, and nobody gives you the respect of time, of after hours. And being single and not having family commitments, etc. I mean, I was working literally 20-hour days, doing my day job and doing my other commitments that I've had to endure. And some of these were very, very exciting. I mean, I was part of the Genetic Alliance of South Africa when it transformed from the South African Inherited Disorders Association, SAIDA. We rebranded it, and I played a significant role in helping set that up. I believe that 1 in 11 live births in the country results in some form of birth defect. And there's very little advocacy for that in the country. I mean, although our constitution says we all have access to health, etc., when it comes to people with inherited disorders who very often manifest with disabilities, very few doors are open to them. And so I took this on as an opportunity to kind of rubber stamp some way of showing advocacy for people who are born this way and they've never asked for it, but to call on some form of action. Yeah, engaging with the media, I ended up being on the list of, the go-to people for various types of issues. And as Prof. Janssen has said before me, we may all have opinions, but we must be experts in particular issues. And so, very often I'd be asked, what did I think about the extinction of mammoths, or some form of issue about that's going on in the country. Whether I was an expert or not, I was asked to say things on this. And at a very early stage, I would never comment on anything unless I saw the scientific article I was asked to comment on, and very often that was embargoed. And I refuse to give interviews on anything that I have not had an opportunity to review. So even though the media are always they need a response like yesterday, I always say, these are my regulations. And if you cannot work with me, then I'm sorry, you can go and look elsewhere. And I take that stance very, very strongly. I may have an opinion, but when you ask me as an expert, then of course I need to bring into my psyche all the rigorous work that we do as academics and researchers. Yeah, so various other things came into play. I also served on the Sarah Bartman reference group, and that was quite significant. I will talk a little bit about my experiences from there and several other things. And then I show this as a kind of footprint of the bringing together, or the nexus of how your science brings you into the fold of issues related to the wider societal issues, and how you need to manipulate that so that you accede to being responsible as a scientist, that you don't hide, but that you engage, and that you engage in a way that brings meaning to science. And I feel very, very passionate about that. And even in the work that I do for the Academy as executive officer currently, I'm very, very passionate about science engagement and communication, because they have different contexts and we need to work with that. And so one of the big things that I kind of took and embraced is the kind of unique genetic record in the genomes of living peoples today who are San. And I was very, very privileged to have worked among several of the groups around the country, and a bit sad that I'm no longer at the bench, because people still call me up or email me wanting to have genetic ancestry tests done and to know about their history, etc., because it brings some meaning to where they've come from. But the impact of the experiences of the San have not always been easy for them to endure. And some people may remember that the San were used in the military by the South African Defence Force in the early 70s, when Namibia was still under the influence of South Africa. And in the Caprivi Strip region, at a military base called the Omega base, the truckers who were recruited from Angola were housed and worked with the South African Defence Force against all the other forces against them. And so these two communities, the June and the Kwe, started to live side by side with their families, and they became known as the 31 Battalion of the SADF, or the Bushman Battalion. And over the years, they grew up to about 3,000, pardon me, soldiers with their families. And very soon, they became very, very dependent on the military for food, for goods and services. And sadly so, a lot of this translated to them becoming dependent on alcohol. And so their dependency on that was prioritized opposed to looking after families and children and so on. But very soon, when independence came on to Namibia in 1990, the South African Defence Force had the dilemma of what to do with these families. So they translocated them from the Omega base to Schmidstrup, which is about 100 kilometers north of Kimberley, and they lived in tented facilities. And this is where in 1992, I went with some colleagues to sample some of those individuals. So while they were at the Omega base, Prof. Jenkins and other colleagues had visited the camp and collected samples for genetic studies. I went with Michelle Ramsey and a few others to Schmidstrup. And subsequent to this now, when the ANC came to power in 1994, one of the issues that they required was that this army be disbanded, and the individuals and the soldiers and the families were once again moved, and this time to Platfontein Farm, close to Kimberley, about 10 kilometers. And for those of you who go to that area, very close to where this development is a very, very good archaeological site that one can visit to see the relics of some of this San culture and so forth. So one of the dilemmas that I have had, having sampled individuals at Schmidstrup, as I become a bit more entrenched in the value of ethics, etc., is how ethical is it to work with a military person to go to a military site and to sample? Although people lined up and gave permission either by signing an informed consent or putting their thumbprint, does one in a military environment have the freedom of choice? And that perplexed me for quite some time, even though having gone on my first field trip, it was very exciting to be out of the lab confines and to go into the field and to engage with people, etc. But from there was born, you know, my new take on reflections of ethics. And I have been involved in several types of research and conversations around ethical issues. But I was invited to a meeting in Brazil in 1995, I think it was, just before I returned to South Africa. And in that article, and this was a bringing together of social scientists and genetic scientists to reflect on the new genomics. It was, again, another very interesting encounter with social scientists, which was very, very encouraging, but at the same time, high maintenance. Nonetheless, I used that opportunity to publish a paper on reflections and prospects for anthropological genetics in South Africa, in which I did talk about some of the experiences of working with the San. But having said that, I think we have upped the game or raised the gameplay with respect to ethics. I think we've been conscientized a lot by, you know, the ethical principles, by various standards at international level. We've had lots of discussions about informed consent, but I still think the issue of informed needs to be taken up a lot more with engagement, community engagement and individual engagement at all spheres when we do science. The issue of broad consent is very, very confusing. And I know that the San communities will not consent to broad consent, meaning that once you've given a DNA sample, that you as a researcher are free to do what you want with it. And they would say, if Professor Sudyal can come to us and apply for a permit to do the work where she discloses what it is she's doing with us, why should the second person just use her data and not come to us? So this is a bit of a seesaw issue when we talk about open science, open access, open data. and we think of it in the broad context of, societal thinking, we very rarely feature what the individual communities have to say about this and how we should, co-create before we embark on these big types of studies. And then, of course, benefit sharing. So what benefit does one bring to communities as you do the work? So what I have done is every single project that I engaged with, where people volunteered to participate, I went back into the communities and I shared the results, and I shared some combined community-related data so that they could use it for their benefit in their communities to reflect on some of the issues related to their own histories. Coming back to the Sarah Baartman reference group, when it was decided that her remains be repatriated to the country, this reference group was established with a whole suite of membership. I was asked to come in because originally they felt that they would like to do DNA analysis on the remains that were repatriated. So just to bring this story into focus, Professor Philip Tobias, some of you may remember him, the famous paleontologist in South Africa. He had written a paper prior to all of this because he was also commissioned by the Department of Science and Technology. At that stage, they were known as DAXT, the Combined Arts and Culture and Science and Technology, to work with the French government to consider repatriation of her remains. And when he made inquiries, he got sent from pillar to post. But essentially, there were about 3 divergent stories as what had happened about Sarah Baartman's remains. So Sarah Baartman, as some of you may know, was born in the Eastern Cape, and she was taken first to be put on show in London, and when a community of Black people thought that that was dehumanizing, she was then taken to Paris, and that's where she died, and her body was dissected by the famous surgeon George Cuvier, and her skeleton became the type specimen for Khoisan, and I'm using the word broadly, Khoisan peoples. And so her skeleton was measured, her brain was removed and put into a jar with chemicals, as were her genitalia, because by European standards, she looked very, very different. And this was part of the reason why she was put on display for people to ogle at her anatomy. So taking us a bit further away, because that is a story on its own right, bring in Diana Ferris, a world-renowned poet who was at the University of Western Cape. And Diana had written this poem called Come Take Me Home. And while you read it, I will tell you a little bit about the story. And colleagues, you just have to listen to Diana recite this. I mean, if there isn't anything that brings tears to your eyes, this will. It has certainly done it for me every single time I've heard it. When somebody from the lower house of the French Parliament heard this poem, he wrote to Diana and asked if he could have permission to translate this into French. She gave permission, and then that was presented to the higher house in Parliament. And using this poem and the way it moved the French Parliament, the government decided to repatriate the remains. Suddenly, the remains were recovered, and Bridget Mabandla, who was the Deputy Minister of DAX at the time, was tasked with the responsibility of going over to France and to bring the remains home. And from the reference group, I was tasked with the responsibility of handing over the remains to the community at the ceremony in Henki. Now, I am an asthmatic, and I was taken to where all the members of the reference group were seated. President Mbeki was president at the time and presided over the interment process. So his helicopter was swirling around and he landed, and I was in the wrong place. I needed to be at the school where the ceremony was taking place to hand over the remains. And it was written as such that only I was the one who was given the permission to remove the specimens from the cast that was sent. So I was rushed with police people to the right location, had to walk through all of this high energy emotion, burning of buku leaves and incense and all of that. And of course, that just triggered my asthmatic reaction. And then it was a time, 2001, after 9/11, etc. You can't travel with knives and things. So all I had was a pair of gloves in my pocket, and the undertaking company assisted me in opening the jars in which the soft tissue were placed, and I had to then scoop this up and hand it over to the communities for the proper interment. There were many, many issues. Firstly, they didn't want the box to be open, but then the grave was dug to the specification of the coffin, not the cast. And so there were a whole lot of issues that happened. And along the way, you learn many, many lessons. You have to engage with minority group leaders, you've got to engage with politicians, and every time you went forward in a discussion, the next meeting you went backwards. And so it would seem that being the scientist who took the notes for each meeting, I kind of brought some reason and some focus to the issues. And so I was always told that my contribution helped. But at the end of the day, we did do what was right to remember Sarah Baartman for these four things: the respect for indigenous peoples, respect and activity around minority groups, highly fueled with with women issues and human rights issues. So I think the symbolism that the Sarah Baartman interment brought into society, or what we should remember it for, are these four issues, which filter into our activities in the present time as well. I've also, as I said, got involved with some bioethics and human rights issues, and in the interest of time, I'll just skim through this. But what I wanted to say is, every step of the way, as you achieve in your science and you publish and you have a face in the public, you get called into all kinds of things. One of my failures, I would say, is trying to work with Professor Wilmot James when he headed up the Africa Human Genome Initiative. And that was the issue related to the nomenclature of peoples. Now, this is a big challenge and a big topic. How do we make reference to people? We talk about people's self-identity, but under whose nomenclature are they gaining or they identify with? I mean, we've all heard about the issues related to the use of colored communities and studies. San is, prescribed by scientists, but it is a bad word if you consider what it means in Nama. How do you make reference to a group of Black people who speak Bantu languages? So you may argue, well, why do you care? Why do you want it? We are individuals. But throughout we talk about race and all the isms. So in 2002, this was a burning question that the Southern African Society for Human Genetics had first asked Trevor Jenkins to take care of, and then he got a bit sick, and then they asked me to take it, and I brought it to the attention of Wilmot, and we hosted a whole workshop. And 10 years or so into our new democracy, we could not reach any format of coming close to it. We were still reflecting on past issues and so on. So I must confess that I could do nothing about facilitating any change in how we address this. And I think it's something that is going to stay. I've dove into several other meetings along the way, involved with ethics, with the H3 Africa project, the Hugo Committee on Ethics, Law and Society. And I mean, you know, I don't want to list all of these, but every single one kind of brought in that combined energy, that combined experience, you know, that the way in which your knowledge builds and how you need to think before you engage your mouth into gear, that thinking process, which you have to do standing on your feet very, very often. So all of these are skills you develop as your confidence develops. And so that is my big message, that the sooner you gain confidence in your own ability and what it is that you can do, nobody can take that away from you. And for me, that came the day I hosted Professor Jenkins at Penn State while I was still doing my postdoc. And he had visited, and he'd always say to me, you know, you must stop calling me Professor Jenkins, because then in company, he'd call me Dr. Sudyal. And kept saying to me, I must call him by his first name. And the day I plucked up the courage to do that, I felt I had grown. And I mean, it's to the point of where, you know, he and I can sit, and if he remembers the stories, I can chirp him a little bit and bring some smiles to his face. So colleagues, one other message, and we've had this discussion during Professor Stella's presentation. And like, you know, where did this prejudice creep into our psyche? And, you know, before you even look at prejudice in South Africa during apartheid, etc., and you go way, way back. I mean, the English and the Irish, you know, they're the same race, so to speak, but they've had their disagreements. Even, you know, ancient Egyptian culture, there were differences. So how is it that today we can, you know, argue? And I mean, I'm a Formula One fan, so all the things going on with Lewis Hamilton, and more recently at the cricket, you know, taking the knee and these sorts of issues. So those become manifestations of these long entrenched prejudices that all of us have had to deal with. And Professor Stella said to us that, you know, it is very hard to imagine a world in which prejudice does not exist, and that we have to work so hard towards trying to get ourselves out of it. So Section 9 of the Constitution, you know, has everything in there to protect us against discrimination on more than one grounds, on the issues of race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, and so on, as you can read on there. And to what extent is it played out? I mean, we have the best constitution on paper, but what's the lived experience in this country leaves a lot to be desired. So another thing that I had done a couple of years ago in a presentation, when, you know, looking at some of the biological factors and social factors that contribute towards discrimination. And this is my take. You can argue where you think they fit. So there are certain things that just are biological in nature and others that are social in nature. So when we talk about race, you must understand what it is we're talking about. There is a biological definition of race, but then there's racism and racist behaviors and so on and so on. So I tried to take a few of the issues that I was talking about and see where I would place them. So basically, when you look at me, you're looking at my physical appearance, which is my phenotypic variation. That's the genetic word. You know, you would recognize my hair color, my eye color, my skin color, and, you know, we'll talk about those sorts of things. But when you're talking about class, you're talking about culture, religion, consciousness, identity, where do all of these fit? And so this is, you know, part of the discussion that we need to embrace, of bringing together the different components that challenge us when we talk about discrimination. And I know I'm going into my time, but Chair, if you just allow me, I just want to talk about this very important component that was life-changing for me. And that's also related to the social impact of science. In 2004, while I was traveling in Australia with my mum and my brother, the first night we spent with family in Perth, who gave us a great welcome, etc. The next morning, around 6 a.m., my mom was up and went to the bathroom, because of the time difference, etc. And she had a particular ritual in the morning. And next thing I heard like a thud. And I went to the bathroom door and tried to call. She did not respond. I tried the door, I could not open it. So I went to the room my brother was sleeping in, and I said, look, I think something's happened to mom. She's in the bathroom. So he rushed and he wanted to break the door down. I said, no, she fell in the bathroom, and I knew where the shower was and the door. And I said, no, hold on. I went to my cousin's bedroom, got her up, and I said, look, this is the problem. And she rushed to her kitchen cupboard, pulled out a knitting needle, and she knew how to open the door from the outside. And when we got into the bathroom, there was my mom lying on the floor, having collapsed in the shower. There was no blood, so she hadn't had a concussion or anything, but her speech was slurred and she couldn't speak. So we wrapped her up, carried her into the room. I quickly checked her sugar, and that was fine, but she suffered a stroke. And so my cousin's relative was a nurse, so we called her, got the ambulance, rushed mom to the hospital. And so we learned that she had a stroke with an infarction on the right side of her brain, almost a tablespoon in size, that left her left-sided paralysis. And for days, she was in a hospital in Fremantle. And when you're in a different country and you've got no contacts, it was the worst experience of my life. To honor one of my mom's biggest wishes, and that was to go to Australia. And she also wanted to go to visit the Queen. She knew everything about the royal family. And so I was honoring one of her wishes and took her to Australia while I had work. And once we finished the work, we were spending time with family. But since then, I learned to recognize the value of the brain and the way in which our neurons are networked. And then I read this book, My Stroke of Insight, and it was written by Jill Bolte Taylor, who herself, a brain scientist at the age of 35, suffered a stroke. And here she's seen giving one of the TED Talks on her own experience. And that brought life into focus to me, because I was a workaholic. And since I was single and I had no family responsibilities of raising children, I now had to deal with a mum who was, the most vivacious person, now paralyzed from a stroke. And over time, the debilitating issues were that she stopped speaking, she could not swallow, she was fed with a pharyngeal tube. And I had to take care of her at the height of my career when I had the National Geographic grant, which necessitated me traveling throughout Africa to collect samples and to do the research. And then you have to prioritize, what is important to you. So I tried to make the best of it. But that whole experience brought into focus to me the added complexities that people experience with disabilities, etc. And I just want to share, the ASAP study on global mental health in an era of sustainable development, research and policy priorities. Mental disease and problems are really, really debilitating. And we give very little time towards this sort of issue. And so I think it is timeless that, wherever we can, plugging for advocacy, particularly now in this kind of COVID era, we hear about, the various social, cultural, and political and other factors that contribute to our understanding of disease, etc. So again, these experiences help shape you in terms of what you want to do in life and what you want to achieve and so forth. And in closing, colleagues, I just want to leave us with a couple of messages. we are always fighting on different ends of this team, the natural sciences versus the social sciences. Let's make it one science. Let's bring in the various elements of expertise from the various disciplines and use this kind of collective to work towards bringing the human into humanity. And if there's anything I have left in my energies for the rest of my living days, I want to strive to bring the human element in humanity. And the only way I know how to do it is to use my knowledge of scientific thinking in a systemic way to build on testable ways of dealing with things. I hope I have some creativity left in me. I try to ask questions and position my quest towards answering them in a sequential way that builds and builds and builds to the next level. And I trust that this kind of short ramble through my personal journey serves as a way for you to punctuate your own. We live in a society in our academic world that cannot be separated from how we think about academic work in the environment of universities, how this is linked with business and the economy and the socio-political kind of environment, and the policies and the rule of law and the way in which we work with government. So, I know you can talk about a quadruple helix, but let's just start with the triple helix and see how we can take this forward and build and nurture the future that we all want and want for the next generations to come. Thank you for listening to me, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to address you this afternoon. Thank you, Chair.
Wow, thank you very much, Jonathan, as well as Himla. Thank you very much for your inputs. I'm not going to summarize, anything which you have said. It is just a question of just reflecting on it. Your personal journeys, are unique and very inspirational. And I think, some of the fellows here might be imagining how their futures may turn out as a result of what they've heard. But it has been very, very, interesting and inspirational to listen to your stories. Without any waste of time, I'm going to, open the floor for comments, questions, and discussion. Any takers? Yeah. Very, very interesting stories which we have heard. Any takers? Anyone?
Matabo's hand is up. Matabo, you can post your question.
Thank you very much, Prof. Sudiel and Prof. Janssen, for the very inspirational journeys. And there's an echo. I wanted to find out, both of your experiences show that you both were first generation academics in your families. I think that's the word that is used. And despite all that, you managed to push through. And many of us in here and the students that we work with in our institutions are also in that same boat. And sometimes the challenges become more than the inherent drive to succeed. So could you please share how you navigated your spaces and how through your journeys up to now, you can advise people who are in the same boat to carry on despite all these naysayers and blockages that keep people outside of the spaces? Thank you.
Okay, I'll have a go at it first. Thank you very much, Matabo, for that question. So there's one thing I want to say, that while I was growing up, two of my cousins, my father's sister's children, my father served as their guardians when their father had died, so they stayed with us. But at the same time, they pursued, postgraduate degrees at University of Durban Westville in psychology. And so I was always like helping them, doing punch card analysis before the days of, big computer. So already when I would go to the university with them on a Saturday to mark, the questionnaires, assess the questionnaires, etc., they would always say, someday you should be able to do this. You should be doing this. One of my cousins married a Professor Balkisun, who was a psychologist. And then that became an added thing because, she married in, but they were also linked with another family member who my aunt had remarried, and that was Professor Ramphal, who was the first Indian professor in the community. So I had that on the one side, but in my nuclear family, we had to work our way. And I must say, my mother was a strong pillar of support, always gave me the opportunities to do what I wanted. And she was the matriarch. My dad was, ask your mother, she knows more about these things than I do. And so that was the saving point, that I had the support of my mom, who herself, in her immediate family, was the only one who got an opportunity to study. All her other sisters were married off in their late teens. So my mom, having had that opportunity herself, saw that it was okay for girls, children to study, and encouraged it. So I think that is what was the secret to the success and support that I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Sure, thanks, Matabo. Great question. I'm going to focus it on the first generation academics as opposed to students, and how do you navigate those spaces successfully? I want to suggest three things. Number one, choose your referential community very carefully. In other words, the people you hang out with in the academic community. If you're hanging out with people who are not productive, if you're hanging out with people who are completely cynical about the academic enterprise, if you're hanging out with people who, just not going anywhere, then of course you become like them. And so I think it is extremely important to pay attention to the company you keep. And for me, it's always important to be amongst people who are better than me, who are challenging me, who are, etc. Number two, find a mentor quickly. The mentor doesn't need to be somebody. I learned this, by the way. I saw his name on the screen earlier, Ahmed from WITS, just forget his surname now, but he taught me, Prof. Wadia, he taught me this years ago, that your mentor doesn't have to be your disciplinary mentor. Your mentor could, so for example, my mentor for many years, unfortunately it's not as well at the moment, was Professor Jabani Mangani. Now he's a clinical psychologist, but I can't tell you how important it was that I met with him once a week on a Friday to test ideas, to offload anger at the University of Pretoria's racism and conservatism, etc. But to have that mentor is extremely important. And then number three, navigate, learn how to focus, learn how to block out other things, because you can become so involved in faculty politics, you can become so involved in departmental minutiae, you can become that you forget. So every morning when I get up, I sort of say, what is it I'm doing today? And I focus like a laser on what needs to be done. Because if you don't, it's so easy to be distracted and discouraged and all of that. So those would be, Matabo, my 3 suggestions.
Thank you very much.
Prof, you muted.
Thank you very much, Imla and Jonathan, for your responses. And I see the chat is also having some comments in which people are appreciating, the insights and the wealth of knowledge which they're getting from your sharing. Any other question? Any other comment? Oh.
And I just wanted to say that the said Professor Ahmed Wadi has also played a very, very significant role in my life as a mentor. He always lived on the floor above human genetics and held my hand in many, many ways, supporting it when he was the head of my school and later the dean, but mostly during his tenure as head of school, made opportunities happen and encouraged. And as we all know, that as you climb up the ladder, you make friends and you make enemies. So I just wanted to acknowledge him as well as playing a seminal role in my personal development, and more so for the doors that he opened. And nothing was ever difficult for him, eh? At any time I could go to him, it wasn't like, oh, wait outside. No, come in, have a seat. So thank you, Ahmed. I really appreciate you, and I'm so happy to see you here. And I am in Johannesburg. Hopefully we can have a cuppa sometime soon.
Except I can't see Ahmed. There's Ahmed.
I'm here. Thank you so much, both of you. I'm in tears. Thank you. Jonathan, I'll never forget you and I working on mentorship in Pretoria, and you telling them, the whole group of academics, about was Jesus a mentor or what? And I have never forgotten that you had academics, lawyers, all kinds of people following a man who had something to deliver. So thank you both. Thank you both.
Thanks, Ahmed. That story wouldn't fly. It could fly at the Calvinist University. I don't think it will fly at Wits. But the other point about Jesus and as a mentor that I often encourage mentors, is to say that even Jesus had a dropout.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you. Great. Thank you. And thank you, UJ, for bringing this together.
Yeah. Well, one of the things which Jonathan did in 2004, when I returned from the University of Illinois, was that he was having a workshop like this with new PhDs at UP, and he asked them to, he asked me to come and speak to them, and he said, Chika, just tell these people, how did you make it that after your PhD, you got one of the best scholarships that can be available, and you go to the US and you come across the world leaders in your field? Please just tell us how you did it, and don't tell us that it's God. And of course, I couldn't help it but to acknowledge that part of it, but also tell my story. I want to touch.
Sorry, but Chika, you're not telling them the other side of the story. And that was when you came back and you were very proud holding your new book. And I think you were very disappointed in me saying, thank you, well done, Chika. Now tell me about the second book.
True. Yeah, no, that was the bubble, because you can imagine as a young scholar seeing your name on the book, and they ask questions, and then the question is, when is your next book? And it made me think. Of course, I've got 3 others since then, though they are edited volumes. I want to touch on the point which you raised, Jonathan, about the issue of mentorship, which is very important. But one of the things that is also important is, the importance of networking within the scholarly community. And if you find a mentor, and sometimes they come in different ways. into your path. And if someone takes keen interest in your career, please don't take that for granted. And one of the most important things is that when they ask you to do something, don't disappoint, deliver on promises. If I told you promise to do something, do it. And in that way, people begin to trust you. People begin to, to know you as someone who is a promise keeper, someone who delivers. And in the process, you are building a brand, and they start mentioning you, recommending you to other, when other opportunities come. And that's something which I think, as a young fellow, as you enter this space, you need to keep in mind.
That is such an important point, Chika. I just wanted to say this: input equals output. So I'm mentoring about 12 postdocs from different universities in South Africa, and the ones that call you every week, the ones that send you something to read every other week, those are the ones that get more out of you. So it is very important to show up.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Any other comments?
Sinead.
Hi, Prof. Jansen, it's Sinead. Thank you so much to Prof. Jansen and Prof. Sudyal. I really appreciated so much, and there were so many things that I was the one who said, preach it. I want to ask a question. I'm still trying to articulate it. When you work with marginalized communities, the work can sometimes be very abstract, especially when juxtaposed with their daily needs. And how do you, so I've also had these conversations about taking the work back. But when you take the work back and you're working with a community, for example, that is mostly illiterate or is not able to eat or drink at work, how do you talk about the merit of the work, or is it enough? I suppose the question is it enough that you are bringing the marginalized voice into the academic record in a case like that? This is, by the way, I've also done work, just to clarify, I've also done work with the Ku and Kwe, Prof. Sudyal. So this is a very personal question.
What's your discipline, Sinead?
So I am currently in communication and media, but my work is very much in cultural studies.
Okay. Sorry, Imla.
Yeah. No, that's a very, very, very good question. And given that my engagement with the communities were about understanding, the genetic heritage, you can't take tools like a presentation, etc., into the field. So I always had a tree close by, tree outside, and the tree has leaves, has branches, has stems, and you can see it grow. So I would say that using my genetic tools, I will try to identify which leaf you are on this tree. And then your journey will be the connectivity of this leaf through its twig, which is on a fine branch, that eventually builds up to a bigger branch that all ultimately converge to a common trunk. And that trunk you can see, but you don't see what's in the roots. And Sinead, believe it or not, I even learned how to say that in Afrikaans. I learned to talk about the blaar and the stamboom and the takke and alles, even though I may not sound as savor in Afrikaans as as others would be. But very soon, when I would take back their results and I would circle the lineage and a little bit about the story, they would tell that same story. And about 2 years later, when I went in the field and we were celebrating the Darwin bicentenary with a crew from the Netherlands covering a documentary, The people said that same story without me prompting. And to me, that was stunning, that the way in which I had communicated my science and the way they interpreted the results I fed back to them, that they were able to share that story without mutating the storyline.
Thank you very much. I see Martha's. I don't know whether Jonathan wants to say anything.
No,
but
no,
Martha's-
I'm covered, Martha.
Yes, thank you so much for this inspiring session. I was just thinking about Professor Janssen's remark, of course, about seeing the lights on late at night. And I'm also one of those people who really entrench myself in my research. And then you get a lot of comments about work-life balance. And I was just wondering, what is your thoughts on work-life balance, especially if your research has somehow become your hobby or it really gives you joy? What is your approach to how much is too much if it continues to get you up and you're excited and it fulfills you more than that Netflix show? Because you're always constantly warned about burnout, but sometimes mostly from those who is perhaps leaving at 1 o'clock or 3 o'clock. So I was just wondering, what is the healthy approach that you would advise us to follow? Thank you so much.
Thanks, Martha. No, that's a very important question. And I want to answer it this way. In my years of working with academics at 5 South African universities, I noticed that the most productive colleagues were actually women with children. The most unproductive were senior men. And the secret I discovered was figuring out what works for you in your particular context. In other words, I'm not suggesting everybody must leave at 7. That's not going to be possible for a mother of, toddlers and so on and so forth. But I am suggesting structuring your time in such a way that you maintain that balance. So what people don't know is I'm a sports fanatic. What people, so you'd be hard pressed to find me doing work on a Saturday afternoon or on a Sunday at all. So there has to be time for family. There has to be time for health. There has to be time for just switching off, and so on and so forth. By the way, can I just recommend my favorite Netflix movie series at the moment? It's called The Good Doctor. It is absolutely fantastic to see this young man with autism become a surgeon and so on. So what I'm trying to say by that is you must have things that take your mind off things. And of course, when my kids were smaller, having duties as a father that complemented what the mother did and so on and so forth. How you work that out will depend on the stage of your career, the situation with children, and so on. But the 7 o'clock at night was just an example, one example of how to use time.
Thank you, Asanda and Don Pell.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, professors, for such enlightening presentations. My question is on the issue of journals. I mean, we're often encouraged to publish in, international journals, Q1 journals. What should we do with regards to our local journals? Should we forget about them and, and just focus only on international journals? I mean, South Africa, we have a number of DTH, approved journals. So what should we do with regards to our local journals? I'll be happy to get a response. Thank you so much.
So I'll kick off and wait for Ivla to respond. So I think it's a healthy thing for an academic, particularly for you guys, at this stage of your careers, to have a mix of journals in the bag. In other words, a mix of local and international. If it's only local, then I think you're at a very sharp disadvantage when it comes to promotion. If it is only international, you have to understand that there's a certain segment of the academic community, that's a research community, that's not going to read this stuff. So I think having a healthy mix. What matters more, though, is the quality of the journal. And there is still a huge number of academics in our universities who are publishing in predatory journals, sometimes out of ignorance, sometimes just out of greed. And so the mix is important. The way I decide, and of course I suspect it would be different in genetics, Himla, it would be different. The way I decide in my field is to say which topic or which issue do I want to flight locally. For example, I'm co-editing a special issue of South African Journal of Science with Shabir Mahdi, the vaccinologist. Now, this is to give a perspective from the global South, on issues like social distancing and as both a sociological concept, but also an infectious diseases, concern. So that I want to do local. But the stuff I just did on bones of contention, critical analysis of anatomy and race science, that would appear in the international. So also looking at which audience do you want to attend to which topic. Having said all of that, a last word, at this stage of many of your careers, I would lean more internationally than leaning more locally, just as you establish your career. Himla, what do you think?
Yes, I totally agree. And so again, when you're talking about your discipline speciality, you got to go for publishing in those sorts of journals. So if you're talking about human genetics, for example, there are a few targeted journals that you would want to submit articles to. Now, having said that, there are some types of genetics studies, like say if you're talking about human evolution, etc., that goes beyond just the generic kind of writing up of stories, that holds a much wider audience. So that goes to like the bigger journals of Science, Nature, PNAS, etc. But when it comes to the specifics of clinical genetics, for example, there's targeted journals. Now, as you mentioned with the South African Journal of Science, it would be ridiculous for me to submit a hardcore genetic study to them because they are looking for interdisciplinary linkages. So your choice of journal is based on best positioning the context of your publication in the disciplinary directed way, or if it manifests on interdisciplinary or types of work, then you target those sorts of journals. So, but I do agree with Prof. Janssen that in the formative years of your career, the broader the audience, the more acceptable your work, the more you get recognized by your peers, and then you kind of establish yourself as a player in that field. So your publications do make you, and I mean, we know of a couple of people who have just published a few, but seminal papers, and they've managed to build their careers for the rest of their lives around that. And we must break away from the sausage factory type publications where you just like punch one word, one idea in everything. It's nice to build nice stories of bringing it all together. So hopefully as you start to look at what you are producing and what are the messages that research is putting out against the national grid and the international grid, you will find the space of where it would be best positioned. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Knox, you've got, you had your hand up, and then Sahid.
Yes, sorry, my computer actually died because I'm being load shed. But, and I did pop my question in the chat. I'm just going to try and remember exactly what I said, but I was wondering, there's quite a lot of talk about imposter syndrome, and I was wondering if either of our professors of the session have ever felt this way. And then secondly, in terms of feeling a little bit despondent, how have they perhaps dealt with that particular issue?
So Knox, if I understand you, imposter syndrome, please, I haven't dealt with that one before, but is it somebody trying to act like you?
Well, it's actually more about the person actually feeling like an imposter within a particular environment or community or, you know, career space. So that particular phrase is generally linked with that rather than somebody being an imposter.
Ah, okay. No, what you see is what you get. And I have to, I live by my belief in what I do. And I always say to myself that unless I am fully confident of what I am doing and what I'm about to say, to keep my mouth shut. And one of my former heads of department used to say that he was always very happy when he went into meetings with me because I would be very, very quiet. But when I opened my mouth, he knew that I had something seminal to say, and you got to watch for where the axe was going to fall. And that used to be quite the joke because I would sit next to him, and if he would say anything out of hand, I'd kick him from under the table, or I would WhatsApp him and say, I think, you know, this is enough. Ahmed Wadi, who's on the line, will know some of these stories because we were in the same room for those sorts of discussions. But Knox, I hear what you're saying, and I strongly believe that I have to be very confident about what I want to say before I engage my mouth in synchronicity with my brain. So if I felt that I wasn't comfortable, I will just be quiet. So I suppose that way I would protect myself from just being a head or a spokesperson in a scenario where I couldn't say much. And if I don't know, I'm quite happy to say, I'm sorry, I don't know. And that's been the secret of my success as well. To know what I know and to know what I don't know and to be able to acknowledge both. Thank you.
I don't think, you know, Knox, that one ever completely feels 100% confident all the time. You know, I sometimes walk into a conference and I see 3 or 4 people who have probably written the most amazing stuff ever. And you know, partly because of our own socialization in South Africa, partly because, you know, one has a history as a Black academic, Black person. I think there's always sort of vestiges of imposter syndrome feelings that I have. But I completely agree with Himla. The trick is to know exactly that piece of work that you're an expert on, and nobody can contradict you on that, right? And that helps a lot. But I would be lying to you if I said they wouldn't, you know, in certain contexts, you say, oh shit, do I have something to say here or not? Or will I say it well enough? It does help because I did masters and PhDs in a country in which people speak before they think, and in which everybody thinks they're supremely smart, which is great on the confidence side, but you got to back it up with content. Okay, and that I think is what Himla is saying. Disappointment is sort of part of the game, and I have learned over time. I suppose I just want to share guys quickly this one story. I as a young scholar, you know, I remember being very disheartened when yet another journal turned me down. So I went to Chiki Ramirez, who's probably written more than anybody else on the sociology of mass education. I mean, literally more than anybody else in the world. And I went into his office and I said, Chiki, you know, I can't believe it. I was teary. I just got another article turned down by a journal. And you know what he did? He says, come with me to my office. I go to his office and he had a huge pile of documents in one corner of his office. He says, have a look at this. I said, what is this? He says, those are all my rejections. And I still get them to this day. And I said, if they can reject this bloke, then one must think about it as part of the game, you know, and just learn from whatever was rejected and go back. And it's not always because I mean, I'm sure Yimla can tell you stories, and the scientists here can tell us stories about how often things that were turned down, okay, by journals later was the focus of Nobel, you know, material. I hear those stories often from scientists. So it doesn't mean you're bad or you did something wrong, but the disappointment, because we're human, we're just human beings, you know.
Thank you. There are some questions in the chat. If you can have a look at them whilst we take, is it Zahir's question? Your hand
It's
was
Sahid.
up. Zahid.
Yeah, that's a great.
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Though part of it, I think they've been addressed by the two profs, and thanks to them for sharing their thoughts and joining with us. I have passionately been following Prof. Jansen right from the while he was at the UFS, University of the Free State, where I finished my PhD. It was biochemistry that I did there, but whenever as a student, I heard that the Vice Chancellor is about to speak, I'm not going there for anything. I'm just going there because of Prof. Jansen, because I want to listen to him as a role model and as a mentor. Though no direct interaction, but whenever he speaks, is like, you know, touching certain part of me that is awakening that ability and that curiosity to actually propel me to be where I want to be in the nearest future. And today I have the opportunity of being one of the fellows, listen to him and to the details of his journey. So thanks, Prof, for being who you are and for inspiring people like us. It's always good to have good mentors and the people you look up to, and they could make your journey very easy and smooth, as we have seen being shared by Prof. Chika himself, the role you played personally in his career as it were. And but for quite a number of people, it might not be like that. It might be very rough, even when you have the so-called mentors. The environment where you operate or find yourself might not be very friendly for you to navigate through the journey. Just like Prof. Imla also said, she mentioned those people that were influential in our journey and career. Can you please tell us, I'm directing to the two of you, Sama, are there instances where you really sat back and feel like, am I doing the right thing? Because of the environment where you find yourself, with the kind of people you relate with, despite the fact that you have the mentors you look up to. Maybe those times that are very similar to what Knox asked. You know, you just feel like, am I really on the right track? And how have you been able to manage such, if there are? I could share one that Prof. Stella shared with us in the morning. She said one of the things is just to turn deaf ears to some of those things, and probably you also come up with your own cliques. If the so-called caucus is the one that is operating against what you want to do. And Prof. Johnson also said you must have the content to back up whatever you are doing. So I would love to really listen to you if you've had such instances in your journey, and how you've been able to undo them, and how they've actually facilitated where you are at the moment. Thank you.
Wonderful question, and I'll have a go at this. So, colleagues, I worked in a department of human genetics, and in that department, we had a counseling section, medical specialists, and laboratory support. And of course, I grew up in the era with Trevor Jenkins, and my interest in research on population genetics was sparked. And after he left, and you know, we had a change of head. Very often, I would be asked, like, how do you justify what you are doing in a department where clinical medical genetics is important and the support for medical diagnostics is relevant. And even against those sorts of background, I was awarded an MRC unit in 2001, and I had it for 2 stints until they decided to change tactic and close some of the external units to focus on HIV research just prior to Glenda Gray coming into the fold. However, every research project in that department did population genetics to ascertain frequencies of the different genetic variants they were assessing. So although their studies were erring towards a clinical outcome, the tools and the data that supported it was population genetics. But even the heads of departments could not acknowledge that. And I stood my ground. And I said, I will continue to do what I do because there are 2 histories to disease. One related to what's happening at the DNA level and the other that's happening at the population level. So I was doing both and bringing together the 2 histories of disease into the fold. And I stuck by my guns. And, you know, I was able to raise money internationally and I was able to do the work. And due to public demand, I had to offer genetic ancestry tests because people started to hear about this in the international sphere. And, you know, could you do this? And it took me over 9 months to get it cleared through the bureaucratic hurdles to offer it as a service in the department. And unfortunately, now that I'm not in the department, the current head has shut that operation down. But what genetic ancestry testing did, over and above testing a person's lineage, it gave every person coming for a test an opportunity to talk to a scientist. Very few people have that privilege. And when they came and I would consult on the days I was consulting, they would ask you questions not related to genetic ancestry, questions that they wanted to ask a professional that they never had opportunities for. And I know my colleagues would say to me, you're spending too much of time with, you know, the clients. Half an hour is what you have. But that I took as part of my responsibility of my scientist, as a scientist, of engaging with the public on issues related to science. And very often, in addition to that, it was related to mentorship. Not mentorship in my field, somebody just wanting to talk to somebody who's willing to listen to their problems. And like Prof. Janssen, who said, everybody has potential, but very rarely do you hear what potential you have. But if you have a fault, you know about it very quickly. So for me, my challenge was to take not just the A students, but to take the students who showed potential and I assess their growth by how they graduated in terms of their deliverables in their performance from a C to an upper C to a B to an upper B to a distinction. To me, that was satisfying. So basically what I'm saying is that when you're in this context of trying to justify what you do, it's not just about the impact factor on the journal, the number of papers you're publishing. It's what you can holistically bring to the table, stand your ground and be assertive. And as Stella said earlier, nobody must tell her what to do. She knows what to do. And I've shared that similar sentiment. I know what I have to do in the broader context of things. I may change and chip and charge from day to day, but then at the end of the time, I know what the gameplay is. And so that's my comment to inspire you. Know your gameplay, stick by the guns in what you believe in, and you will find that potential due to the passion that you bring and the passion that you have for what you want to deliver, to make your work become important in the context of adversity. Thank you, Chair.
That's a great response. I'm not going to go back to Saeed because I think Imla covered a lot of ground. I just want to speak very briefly to Zaid's comment on what we think of higher education post-COVID. I'm actually very worried because I don't see universities making the necessary adjustments to prepare for, future pathogens, future lockdowns, future everything epidemiologists warn us about. It's as if nothing happened. We teach as if nothing happened. Nobody's coming up with new inventions, for example, about how to do professional training, using online digital facilities. Everybody's just pretending there isn't a problem. Another thing is there's a huge gap between a Fort Hare and a Stellenbosch or a Walter Sisulu and, a UCT in terms of the infrastructure that is available for switching modes, such as face-to-face to remote emergency teaching, and then eventually online learning. So I'm worried about that kind of stuff. I worry about, in the context of our research, on absolutely no accommodation made for example, women academics who have been hit much harder than men in the context of the progression of the careers. I worry about places like UNISA, where a young academic told me the other day she teaches 12,000 students. I lie you not. Okay, and I've heard that often enough to know and then what do? You do what lazy people do. You go for multiple choice as opposed to essays in disciplines where, writing and thinking is a very important part of it. The inattention to those issues, Zaid, worry me enormously.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and Himla. I think we are going to entertain the last round of questions because we need to wrap up in the next 9 minutes. But there was also a question around the journal article. There it says, question: does the length of the journal article make a difference if it is an accredited reviewed journal? Question from Munir.
Yumla will talk to the sciences more specifically. It absolutely doesn't make a difference in general. The quality of the article is everything. However, it's, when you write for a sociology journal, it's very different from writing for a mathematics journal. And so there are disciplines in which shorter articles that are punchy with writing. I don't know if you guys have seen law articles. I mean, it's probably the shortest I've ever seen in any discipline. So there is variation depending on the discipline. However, the key issue is the quality of what you put down. You can put down a whole lot of quality in 7 pages and write a whole lot of crap in 20 pages.
I totally agree. And one of the things I learned from Mark Stoneking was the trick of using degrees of comparative to hit home your message. So you don't say the same thing in that same way, but you build up the argument so that you say it once, you hit it again with a few additional strong, powerful sentences, but keeping it very, very simple. And that's what I always loved about reading Mark Stoneking's papers. It was like you're reading a bedtime story to a kid. There's no big words, no complex thought, straightforward, but building that story and building it so that when you hit it with that final statement, you have encapsulated, the whole argument that you wanted to punt in your study. And also, colleagues, when Mark Stoneking, etc., published that original article claiming, the out of Africa theory concerning modern human evolution, there was a big backlash. And I mean, I've seen the articles in his office from, various communities because they didn't want to listen to this kind of science. And took plug shots at him personally over the years for this kind of research. And so you just got to stand your ground. Length of topics don't matter, provided you can give out your message clearly with the least complications of words, and build it up so that when you make the first statement, you want your reader to kind of preempt what you're going to say next. And that style of writing I found very, very encouraging, which was very different to the Trevor Jenkins style, because his style was a lot more about the historic narrative. And then I tried to combine the two to find my own space. And I hear myself thinking like Trevor Jenkins when I write some things, and I hear myself thinking like Mark Stoneking, and also some of the other authors that you admire over the years. So I think length doesn't matter, but you got to find that space that works for you, so that like in an interview, you don't give a big answer like I'm giving now, but you like prompt your interview panel to whet their appetite sufficiently in your first response, so that you prompt the next question in that interview. It's almost like being able to direct a conversation. And I think that's the art of writing. And I'm practicing my skills, Jonathan, with the ASAP newsletter. And I don't know if you've had an opportunity to look at the September issue, but we're currently working on the December issue. And I will write a piece about this presentation, because there were 3 ASAP members participating today. And you know, like the contributions we're doing to support this program, etc. So I'm trying to pull out pieces from conversations, from what's in the national media and international media, to tie pieces together to practice for my retirement when I eventually write my coffee table book that I have on my bucket list to do. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. I just want to invite our guest, Jonathan and Himla. I see we are left with 4 minutes, just to share last comments for the scholars or the fellows here, in terms of as they think about their journeys going forward, in the light of some of the challenges which you have heard they face, you know, both at the institutional level. Earlier on, we spoke about institutional cultures. We spoke about, you know, the role of mentors and so on. Just a few parting words that will take us to 15:45, when I'll be handing over to Kirti.
Let me kick off and just say 3 things very quickly. Number 1 is never let anybody take away your joy. Enjoy this incredible moment in your academic career. There's a lot of negative stuff, a lot of negative vibes on campuses, budget cuts, all of this stuff. And I think it's really, really important to enjoy what you do. And this is a wonderful community in which to do so with your peers. The second thing is, yes, it is correct that you might have very difficult circumstances with your head of department, your dean, a colleague, a competitor, and so on and so forth. But just remember this: all of you will soon be, if not already, heads of departments. Many of you will be academic deans. Hopefully, some of you will become vice chancellors and deputy vice chancellors. And you will then have the opportunity to correct what you experience as wrongs in the present. For example, most deans that I work with and heads of departments are very, very reluctant to understand a very simple principle of academic leadership, and that is you create the spaces in which your young academics can travel, can see the world, can move to other labs, as opposed to administrative deans, which is most of our people, for whom you are a unit of labor. And therefore, my only concern is who's going to teach Psychology 101, okay? As opposed to saying, maybe if she goes and works with so-and-so at Berkeley or someplace in the Sussex, that person comes back with much more energy, much more experience, much more knowledge. I can't find leaders that think like that. You know, they only care about the here and now. You have a chance because you know. And then finally, I beg you, don't take on administrative jobs until you have firmly established your career. There will be pressure. Some of that pressure is just nobody else wants to be HOD. Some of the pressure is we need an equity person. We've never had a black head of psychiatry or chemistry or whatever the case may be. Try as much as you can not to become bogged down by those jobs, which, unless you can manage, and some do, because it really breaks your speed, your momentum, as you try to establish a productive career.
Yes, wise words, which some of us need to take even in our current situations. But the last point is what I was going to punt for, is that as you are developing your career, as academics, you are reviewed for your research contribution, which includes your publication, your academic teaching, training of students and supervising of postgraduate students. And then there's that component of academic citizenship, which in my kind of wagon wheel diagram, I showed you how several things got intersected into my portal. You have to manage that, and you have to manage that cleverly. And I mean, I've had friends who would not do any of this go-to work. But there's one thing I stood by, that I would not listen to corridor talk or get involved in corridor arguments without making a statement that if I believe something is wrong, that I must leave it for others to fight for. Those issues which I felt strongly about, I took it on. For example, working in an environment where diagnostic work was much, much more important to research, you had to fight for every ounce of activity you needed to have to conduct research. And so I took the fight all the way to chairing the Research Development Committee at the NHLS, to which I had a seat on the board to be able to punt for research. So you got to pick your fights that's going to allow you to grow in this ambit or space of academic citizenship. And I cannot disagree, or I mean, I would love to agree again with the first point, that if you do not enjoy what you're doing, you might as well give it up. And what did Jonathan say? Go and sell insurance. Mine is go sell samosas on the beachfront. It gives you two things, right? You get the money, you get the beach, and you get to watch all the hunks at the same time. So yeah, no, you have to do what you believe in. Jonathan, earlier in the conversation with Prof. Stella, Knox raised a very important question, which I think we should consider taking some leadership at the academy over this. And the issue focused about, the kind of mindset of the institutional culture and fold with respect to transformation. And I offered that we will sit and engage with her. And maybe with this program, we could host a webinar in the way in which this program is to enhance the environment in which these young productive scholars will grow, but for us to address the issues that need to change or to transform in that academic fold that this new generation is going to move into. So obviously it needs some thinking, but I think with your leadership, Jonathan, and the young scholars in this program, we could host something to make a difference and a contribution. And I kind of put it in the chat earlier, but I think that's something we could do. And again, I wish everybody well. I mean, the time is right. We live in very difficult and challenging times. The other thing I would like to say is to have some sounding of what's happening in that policy space. So, we've just recently had the white paper on science and technology published. So if you are vying for money to some of the funders, you should know what is the architecture of the environment space in which we operate. What are the sorts of priorities that are being set? I'm not saying everybody must do those, but leave a bit of space in what you are doing to be able to score some brownie points for lending your support towards some of these national initiatives. The decadal plan is soon to be put out from the DSI. And when you see that, you'll get a better understanding of the foothold of which the national environment is being shaped. So I see our organizers showing the face. So I think that's time for me to put a zip on it and say thank you once again for giving me this opportunity to participate. Thank you all.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.